And on behalf of Global Ties Alabama, it's an honor for me to welcome you to our Global Perspectives Institute today. We're very excited about the discussion that will take place this afternoon. And we do invite those of you who are in the audience to participate, especially during the Q&A. And so you can always put a question in the chat, and or you'll be able to raise your hand. You can use functionality on your computer to raise your hand. And we'll do that probably during the last 15 minutes of this webinar. Critical race theory, I think many of us know, is a term that's been used a lot in the last 6 months. And what we have found is that there are few people who really understand the meaning of it. Some think it is a theory, others think it's a call to action. We've heard that there's been a lot of discussion, especially during our 2022 legislative sessions across the country. There are definitely attempts to regulate how teachers can discuss certain topics that have always been a free option for them to teach around racism and sexism and other issues of systemic inequality. So we thought that it might be good to go back to basics. And for that, we said, let's find the subject matter experts, those who are actually familiar with the not only the term, but how it has evolved from the beginning. And we were so fortunate to be able to find Professor Brian Fair. We will have as our moderator this afternoon one of our diplomatic corps members, Michael Wells, who is a very seasoned legal professional with significant years of experience globally, locally, in every sector that you can think about. And so we felt that he might be the most appropriate person to moderate this discussion this afternoon. So I will turn it over to Micah.
Jackie, as always, thank you very much. It's always a wonderful opportunity to be able to be involved with anything that Global Ties does. So thank you very much. This is a wonderful topic, critical race theory. And what is it? You hear it on the radio, on TV every single day. And like you said, we have an absolute wonderful expert by the name of Professor Fair. Usually I give an introduction very, very shortly, but because Professor Fair is quite impressive, I want to make sure I do him full justice. So I'm going to read a little bit about his background. He has an undergraduate degree from Duke, and he has his JD from UCLA. He then worked for Brian Cave in Los Angeles, and in 1987, he joined UCLA as a faculty member. He has been with the University of Alabama since 1991, and in the year of 2000, he became the Thomas E. Skinner Professor of Law, which is quite impressive to have an endowed chair. He also is the author of a book called Notes of a Racial Caste Baby, Colorblindness in the End of Affirmative Action. That was published by NYU Press in 1997, and his research agenda remains focused primarily on the equality theory under the 14th Amendment and the central theme that equal protection jurisprudence has lost its anti-caste moorings, rendering it largely obsolete to address significant forms of American caste. So those of you who don't understand legalese, that means this guy's an expert. He's an expert. So again, I just want to say that critical race theory is a deep intellectual thought process that I learned about 30 years ago in law school. And to see it now brought forth and become mainstream really is amazing. And so I think there's a lot of misnomers, and we have the right person here, Professor Fair, who's going to give us an introduction. So with that, Professor Fair, I open the floor up to you. We'll let you go for the next 25 minutes, and then at 1:30, we'll start opening it up for questions. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Micah. I appreciate it very much. Jackie, Charles, Kazia, all of you at Global Ties, and all who are joining today, thank you for the opportunity to share a bit of time with you. the expert on critical race theory, or the experts, at least the ones that I turn to, are Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic. Regrettably, they are not in Alabama currently, although they are teaching on the faculty at Alabama. They are currently in Seattle and teaching a class, and there was a class conflict that really prevented them from joining. And I hope that as they return, or if they're able to return to Alabama, that they'll have an opportunity to meet many of you as well. Richard and Gene published a book in the late 1980s, early 1990s, called Critical Race Theory, a Primer. There's a second book by Dorothy Brown that is a case book that has case materials, but also titled Critical Race Theory. The scholarship in critical race theory runs into the tens of thousands of pages with books and law review articles, and there are practicing attorneys and judges who use principles of critical race theory in their work. As Micah suggested, critical race theory is usually a course that's taught over 45 to 60 hours over the course of a semester. And so we will not be able to get the kinds of detail that you would get if you were to look at the specific work of Richard, Gene. My introduction to critical race theory came from Derek Bell. Derek Bell was a professor of law at Harvard, a former civil rights attorney, who concluded in his work that certain features of racism are permanent parts of American society, all of its institutions, and that existing civil rights law would never dismantle that racism. And he had a leading case book on race and racism in American law, published a number of books and that were allegorical tales about what might have happened in our society. If you've never read Derek Bell's work, or Richard Delgado's work, or Gene Stefancic work, Kimberly Crenshaw, a founding mother of critical race theory, wrote very influential law review articles in the 80s and 90s about racial reform in our society, followed by periods of backlash and retrenchment. Patricia Williams, another leading scholar. And the other thing I'd say at the outset is this. Critical race theory today at times takes on a particular subgroup focus. So there are some critical race theorists who primarily look at the experiences of Asian Pacific Islanders. There are others who look primarily at the experiences of the Latinx community, Mexicans or Puerto Ricans or other Latinx people, who look at immigration law and policy. Others look at the experiences of African Americans in the United States. And there are some common features to their work, and we'll talk some about that. Again, my introduction came when I joined the faculty at the university at UCLA. I began to read Derek Bell's work, and the work resonated with me because it sort of explained the world that I experienced, the world that I lived, the country that I lived in. He talked about the ways in which laws and policies and institutions in the United States skew in favor of some and against others. And that's how I experienced life and living in the United States. I've spent my career thinking and writing about inequality in the United States and the failure of law to eliminate it. We have not eliminated inequality in the United States. I don't know anyone who thinks we have eliminated inequality. There are some people who believe we've eliminated racism. Others might believe we've eliminated sexism. Others might believe we have less discrimination against sexual identity or sexual orientation, or that we've eliminated classism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is not how I see the world. It's not how I see this country. And I mention the world, and I'm grateful to be talking to you all because critical race theory has taken on a global context. As Micah said, the theory of critical race theory, the principles of critical race theory have been adopted in disciplines outside of law and have expanded to other countries as people think about the ways in which the law serves the dominant group in a society, whether that dominant group is male, whether the dominant group has a racial identity, for example, in the United States, whites, and how the law may racialize others as outsiders. And I'll say more about that. My goal has, in my work, has been to examine why there is so much inequality in a country supposedly founded on the rule of law and on a constitutional principle of individual rights and, more recently, equality under the law. So one way to think about critical race theory, there are lots of critical theories in academic literature and scholarship. Critical race theory is just one of them. Some people look at these kinds of questions through an economic lens. Others look at it in a more formal, what is called legal formalism, where the law is what the law is. Judges are obligated to follow the law as it's published and written. Others look at the law through what is sometimes called legal realism. We have a literature on feminist theory. Sometimes that is broken down into critical race feminism. So there are lots of theories out there that I can assure you are not being taught in K through 12 classrooms in the United States. They're not generally being taught in undergraduate classrooms in the United States. Critical race theory grew out of what was called the critical legal studies movement, a movement by academics, legal academics, lawyers and judges who thought the law was not objective, that the law was not neutral, that the law indeed advanced the interest of some and disadvantaged others. And out of that critique, critical race theory emerged when Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard and Delgado and Gene Stefancic and Patricia Williams and Alan Freeman and others began to say, well, you have this critical assessment of the law, but you're not talking about race. Race is invisible in your work. And they then took up the question, well, let's ask similar questions, but through a racial lens and from the perspective of people of color. So in my own work, I began to ask, why does American society look the way that it does? Why do its institutions, why do its schools, its employment, its voting patterns, why does our society look the way that it does? Another way to ask the same question is to ask, what is the status quo in the United States? And why are things the way they are? Now, these are questions that I was asking myself as a young child in Columbus, Ohio. Why were schools segregated in Columbus? Why was I living in a neighborhood that was 99% African American? Why were there two neighborhoods like that in two school districts largely like that in Columbus? So I've been asking these questions for a long time. What critical race theorists did was they began to develop a discourse, a language by which to ask similar questions. So these are the types of questions that critical race theorists ask. And again, they ask those questions from the perspective of people of color. Now, it seems to me that different Americans answer this question about the status quo, why the country looks the way it does, differently. And that's going to cross whatever categories. So I'm not suggesting an essentialist approach. I don't believe that all African Americans see the country one way. I don't believe that all Native Americans see the country one way. I don't believe that all whites see the country one way. But there is a story about the United States that is told. And some people tell the story. It's a triumphal story. It's a description of a nation. It's American exceptionalism. It's the principles of life, liberty, and property, the pursuit of happiness. It's liberalism. It's principles of individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. There's even a principle of equality under the law. And there's a story about this constant progress in our society, including around principles of equality, a march toward greater equality for more numbers of Americans. That's a story that I think some people believe is the story of the United States. And there may be various people from different groups or populations of Americans who believe that story. I think others in the United States see the experience of American life quite differently. And in this way, I think about Native indigenous people, Native Americans, and the conquest of American Indians and the creation of this federal ward relationship between tribal communities, sovereign communities, and the federal government. And I wonder, and I think critical race theorists ask, how do various indigenous people see law and social institutions in the United States? African Americans, we can ask the same question about various African Americans. After a history of slavery and Jim Crow and over-policing and over-incarceration, the restrictions on the franchise, voter suppression, how do different African Americans see the country's laws and institutions? And we could go through, we can ask about the conquest of Mexico, the taking of northern Mexico, and the treaty following the conquest of Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the exploitation of Mexican nationals who remained in the United States, the taking of their land, the organized taking of their land, and the failure to recognize their land rights. How do different Mexicans and other Latinx people see the institutions of the United States? If we think about immigration policy, we know that in 1790, Congress declared that only persons racially classifiable as white could become naturalized citizens in the United States. That was one of the first acts of the 1790 Congress. A racial limitation on immigration would exist in the United States. Some point in 1952, others point in 1965. But that means for essentially 150 years in this country, naturalization was limited on the basis of race. And so how do immigrants, especially recent immigrants, think about this country? And again, I'm sure there are going to be different responses to that kind of question. Critical race theorists think about race as a social construction. Critical race theorists believe that racial categories are fictions. They are socially constructed under law to serve the interest of the dominant group, to racialize and create an outsider status for others. There is no biological integrity, no genetic integrity in the scientific knowledge that we have today about races. And Haney Lopez and others, Haney Lopez's book, White by Law, discusses sort of the invention of this sort of racial category of whiteness and efforts by lots of non-whites from India, from Persia, from Europe to petition courts to be recognized as white persons in the United States. Why would it be important to be recognized as a white person in the United States if there weren't some currency, some benefit that attached to that? Those are the kinds of questions that other critical race theorists are asking. If racial categorization is not a scientific fact, but rather a social construction. Why is it socially constructed? And why are these different categories? There's the category of white, of black, of Mexican or Asian, or even within some of Jean Stefansik's work looks at the treatment of Irish persons, and Jewish persons, Italian persons who are immigrating into the United States, and their treatment as non-whites initially under the law of the United States. So why would that be? What's going on there? And then others, David Roediger, Noel Ignatieff, discuss, again, the invention of whiteness, this category, and the benefits that attach to being racially classified as white. Again, other critical theorists are especially interested in the regulation of sexual identity, the regulation of sexual orientation through law and through institutions. Some of them refer to themselves as queer critical theorists, queer, where they're claiming that term, not in a derogatory way, a term they're using themselves to describe their work, but looking at the differential treatment and the outsider status of the LGBTQ community in the United States. And then Kimberly Crenshaw, in addition to this sort of notion of sort of an institutional dominant backlash to racial reform, she also introduces a principle called the intersectionality principle. The intersectionality principle, which essentially means that no person has a single identity. People are, they may be their ethnic identity, they may be their gender identity, they may be their religious identity, they may be their economic class or identity, and that at any given time, all of those different identities are at work. And so Crenshaw suggested in some important work that there are times when it's hard to know whether discrimination is occurring because someone is Black or female or Jewish or working class, etc. And that the existing law, existing paradigms of law respond to each of those rather than to them collectively, often leaving people not able to prove that they were the victim of racial discrimination or that they were the victim of one of those discriminations, but rather trying to provide evidence that one or more of those was at work. So as Micah said, critical race theory is a scholarly movement. It's an academic scholarly discipline and methodology, a way of thinking about race and law and societal institutions. It seeks to lay bare the centrality of racism in American law, customs, institutions, culture, and its people. Again, Bell and others, Derek Bell and others, suggested that that racism is not an aberration in American life, it is a norm in American life. It is a part of the fabric of this country and all of its people. Charles Lawrence, another critical race theorist, said that racism may be conscious, but it may also be unconscious, using social science and literature from psychology, suggesting that there are times when, because if racism is part of the culture, we may not even know that what we're saying or what we're doing is in fact, or the policies that we're adopting are racist. So Lawrence made some important contributions early to the literature on critical race theory. Critical race theory focuses on the lived experiences of non-whites, which is a fundamental difference in it seeks to listen to and hear the voices of people of color and how they experience the country, how they experience life in the United States, and acknowledges the significance of those voices, those experiences, that sort of in a term sometimes referred to sort of as epistemology, that there's a truth and a knowledge that arises from those experiences as well. And if most academic writing is only focusing on norms and using males or females or whites, but not looking at people of color, there's an absence of reality there that should be brought into the conversation. So the goal of critical race theory, as is the goal of most legal theories, that is the goal of the writing, the goal of the critiques of American law, of its institutions, of its culture, is ultimately to promote equality, to improve the lived experiences from the perspective of people of color in the United States. The idea is to reduce the continuing subordination of people of color in all of the institutions of the United States, whether we look at healthcare disparities, incarceration rates and disparities, policing, whether we look at housing, employment opportunities, educational attainment, or whether we look at cumulative wealth. I think Delgado and Stefancic suggest that there is almost a 10-to-1 disparity in the cumulative wealth of African Americans and whites. And they ask, why is that? What has happened to create that kind of disparity in the United States? Is that normal? Is that to be expected? So again, the goal is to produce substantive equality in the United States, measured by the actual experiences of people of color, not the dominant culture. They see the status quo, that is the existing law and legal regime, as a system of laws and policies and practices that protect the interest of the dominant group, and in that, at least the dominant racial group in the United States has been and remains, in my view, whites. Not all whites, clearly. We have many poor whites in the United States. They seek to dismantle racial hierarchy, and they discuss racial hierarchy, and to specifically the nation's commitment to notions of white supremacy, the benefits that attach to being racially classified as a white person in the United States, and specifically notions of white racial privilege. Stephanie Wildman and others have written about the invisible white privilege. Peggy McIntosh at Wellesley has written about the invisible knapsack of white privilege, other critical race theorists. For race crits, the end game is racial equality for all through laws and institutions that take seriously the lived experiences of people of color. And not only is that the goal, but part of the critique of critical race theory, and this is probably another one of Derek Bell's contributions, is that, and Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell and Crenshaw suggested that there are periods of reform, there are clear periods of reform in the United States. They argue, as critical race theorists, that most of those reforms reflect a kind of interest convergence, that there's a convergence between the interest of dominant whites and people of color at a given time that cause whites to yield and accept a particular racial reform. Derek Bell suggested that's why Brown was decided the way it was decided in 1954. and again, Crenshaw and her work suggest, again, that there are certain kinds of compromises that happen over our history. I think she points in some of her work to the Compromise of 1876, when the Hayes-Tilden Compromise gave the Republicans the White House, and as a compromise, it was agreed that federal troops would be removed from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. So again, there would be things like that. I could go on. What I've tried to say, I'll just take 2 more minutes, Micah. Basic tenets: racism is an ordinary part of American life. Interest convergence explains reforms more than a change in the hearts and minds of the dominant group in the United States. Race is a social construction, not a biological fact. The lived experience of people of color are often ignored, and they are important. And so part of the writing of critical race theorists includes narratives, storytelling, very, very personal stories. If you, Micah mentioned my book, I tell the story of my early life in Columbus, Ohio, and opportunities through affirmative action programs that opened up doors for me at Duke and UCLA. And then finally, that again, the status quo, including current civil rights legislation, will not transform the society. We need new strategies and new approaches and new perspectives to change the society. I had thought I would say a word about Christopher Rufo and this invented assault on critical race theory, but maybe I can take that up in the question and answer period. I hope that begins to provide you with some introduction, and Mike, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you. Professor Fair, excellent job. Thank you so much. I'm going to start off with the first question. I know I shouldn't, but I just want to say one thing. It's more of an observation. I think that the guests will have seen that critical race theory is a very deeply intellectual, philosophical train of thought, that it's just not a CRT, and they want to attack it. And that leads into my question, because it's so deeply philosophical, but yet still you have people who don't understand it. And if one of the core tenets is equality of all human beings in our country, why is there such a backlash? I just don't understand that. People don't understand. It's sophisticated.
Well, again, in this format, we certainly can't go into the language of critical race theory, the different ways in which racism is defined, substantive, procedural. What I can say is this, and again, this goes to, I think, certainly some of Derek Bell's work and some of Kimberly Crenshaw's work. It seems to me that we are currently in a period of backlash, and there's a backlash, and I think Richard would say, Richard and Jean would say, that critical race theory is the straw boogeyman. There's no real attack on critical race theory. There is an attack, however, on anti-racism and diversity training programs, and that's what Chris Rufo ultimately went after. Chris Rufo was a fairly anonymous filmmaker, published a film about homelessness in San Francisco, which homelessness activists apparently found reprehensible and misrepresenting the population of people. But recently, someone sent him a training video from some kind of diversity training workshop. And then he invited people to send him more. And so he's received thousands of messages about what kinds of things are being done through diversity training programs. He began to look, and this is the New Yorker published an article about Rufo and this end run to critical race theory. Rufo said, "Oh, these people say that they are using principles of critical race theory. So the problem isn't the diversity training program. The problem isn't anti-racism. The problem is critical race theory." And he went on Fox, Tucker Carlson, and said that critical race theory is an existential threat to the country. And the next day or soon thereafter, he received a call from the Trump's chief of staff, Mark Meadows. He was invited to the White House. He was asked to help draft federal legislation. On that Tucker Carlson show, apparently Rufo said, you have the power, Mr. President, to ban this kind of training in federal programs. Trump took the bait, drafted a policy, which has since been abandoned by the Biden administration. But Rufo suddenly was a celebrity, is a conservative celebrity now, and legislators in a number of jurisdictions have proposed legislation banning critical race theory. The newly elected governor of Virginia ran an anti-critical race theory campaign. The governor of Alabama is campaigning with an ad that says, "I banned critical race theory in elementary schools," even though nobody's teaching critical race theory in elementary schools, because again, it's academic theory, and theory is usually laden with jargon that third graders just wouldn't quite get yet. But again, there is this boogeyman now that is critical race theory. No one seems to be engaging the ideas of critical race theory. It's just a placeholder for the kind of anti-racism DEI training that some people are doing, and maybe some people aren't doing well.
It sells well. It sells well in certain places. I'd like to open it up for our remaining guests. If somebody would like to ask Professor Fair a question, please do. Don't be bashful. If not, I'll take up the time.
All right, we see Jack.
I have
Jack.
a couple of concerns. Thank you. That's okay. Thank you, Professor Fair, for spending your time with us, sharing this information. And you pretty much just answered my question and concern. I was curious as to why did this all of a sudden become a hot topic? Here I am, 47 years old. I had really never heard of critical race theory till a couple of months ago. Yeah. And then, like you said, you got politicians who joined in on this and just made it sound like it was the worst thing ever. For example, our governor, I banned critical race theory in Alabama schools, but you want to be our leader. To what you explained to us, it is about equality. Yeah. But for some apparent reason, people are thinking it's white versus black or black versus white.
Right. It's clearly not an assault on whites. It's really assault on the legal institutions and the history and laws of the United States and policies that both past and current that operate in the country. And critical race, there are whites who are critical race theorists. There are, again,
absolutely.
There's lots of diversity in the critical race theory community, and there's some disagreement within the critical race theory community too. It's not groupthink in any way.
It's intellectual discussion. Since
That's
when
right.
now do we want to ban intellectual discussion to even talk about something?
That's right. Well, so again, some people say that this is a move that again galvanizes a particular population and gets them to the polls. It's a move that takes other issues off the front pages, like January 6th and the insurrection in the United States. It plays to certain people. And look, it's clear to me that when Democrats or critical race theorists or others talk about the changing demographics in the United States, that by 2040, 2050, this will be a majority minority country, that for some people who either racially identify or classified as white, that is scary. And so I think there are a number of different reasons, but again, what this New Yorker article suggests, Reginald, is that this was a ploy by Christopher Rufo. He's now a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So he's gone from, again, a relatively obscure existence to now a fairly high profile position at a conservative think tank. And all he did was brand certain ideas as critical race theory, even though the ideas of critical race theory are far more sophisticated, as Micah suggested.
I'd like to say it's a little bit more simpler than that. This is the Willie Horton of 2022. So, and then I know Jackie has a question. Go ahead. Sorry, Jackie.
Oh, no,
Thank
no
you.
problem. Brian, you had alluded to the global context. Could you share a couple of examples where globally this CRT has raised its head?
So let's see, it's probably been 15 years, 10 to 15 years since the United Nations adopted a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But there have been Indigenous people movements in lots of other countries. So people have been writing about those movements in Canada, in Australia, in Europe. There's been great concern about hate speech, for example, and Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic and Angela Harris and Stephanie Wildman and others, Mari Matsuda, published some books about how certain words wound people and should be prescribable under the law, but the law, the First Amendment, at least in the United States, generally doesn't permit that. So what has happened is critical race scholarship has informed scholarship in other jurisdictions. And so it's just, as we, critical race theorists will sometimes borrow from European philosophers. Well, now we see others borrowing from critical race theorists in their writings. And so there's been this sort of explosion of people, again, and it's not just in law, it's in political science, it's in education, it's in other social sciences that we are seeing, and we see judges in legal opinions beginning to identify critical race theory principles as part of legal analysis as well. Al?
Yeah, Kendi and Reynolds in their book Stamped from the Beginning talk a bit about the fact that, yeah, you can have all this academic stuff, but it's not going to change the minds of the people who, were taught a certain way or grew up a certain way. I think they have a version of that book for kids, if I'm not mistaken, but this is just my opinion now, because I kind of struggled through it. I enjoyed reading it, but it's dense.
Yep.
But if there was some type of a Reader's Digest version of that book, or something that was a little more in a popular vein, I think that might go a ways to getting other people to at least look at it and read about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. So there's a lot of work is being written currently, again, around principles, so-called anti-racism principles. Robin DiAngelo has a book called White Fragility: Why It's Difficult for Whites to Discuss Racism, Identify Racism, and sort of have discourse around racism. Ibram Kendi has a How to Be an Anti-Racist. There are books like that. Again, for critical race theory itself and understanding its foundation, I would recommend Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic's primer on critical race theory. It's in its 3rd or 4th edition. And after each chapter, there are a dozen or so articles or other books. So someone, let's see, Dr. Libby Parker asked, again, for a reading list. I can certainly, a reading list is provided after every chapter in Richard and Jean's book. And so if you all are going to do some kind of group read, I would recommend that you read Richard and Jean's book. The Dorothy Brown book has an introduction to critical race theory principles, but then it's followed by a series of cases. It's really designed for a law school course. And whereas Richard and Jean's book is really written for a lay audience to introduce the central tenets or ideas of critical race theory. So I'd say one more thing.
Or you could do what I do, which is watch John Oliver and see his critical race thing. It's on YouTube. It's pretty interesting.
Yep. John Oliver's fabulous for what he does. UCLA Law has, I think, has the first critical race studies program in the United States. And so on its website, there would be materials on that program, including, again, the core, the central ideas of critical race theory. But students are enrolling there in a course of study. And it may be the only one of its kind. Others teach a course or two on critical race theory, but I think UCLA, at least at one time, was the only US law school that had a program or course of study. Ken?
Professor Fair, thank you for a great presentation today. I wanted to ask you briefly about your thoughts regarding the misrepresentation of critical race theory and the conflation with Black History Month. We've heard a lot of that going on this month. We've heard a lot of schools that have been receiving complaints from parents about what's being taught. It's all being put in one basket. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I guess we've had Black History Month for, I don't know, 80 years or so. I guess the question, and why do we have Black History Month? Because so many school systems neglected in their basic curriculum to teach anything about the African-American experience in the United States. That's why Carter G. Woodson and others proposed, and that's why Black History Month began. In a post-critical race theory world, Black history would be taught along with the histories of other populations of people every day in our schools, right? So when we don't teach in this country the experiences of indigenous people, children don't know. When we don't teach civil rights. We don't teach the civil rights material in many of our schools. And so children don't know. I have students who come to law school all the time who have no idea of what happened at the University of Alabama, or what happened in Selma, what happened in Jackson, Mississippi, or Oxford. No idea about the civil rights movement. And so we've done a poor job, Kenneth, we've done a very poor job of teaching about the experiences of different people who have lived in the United States and who've lived with longstanding discriminatory practices. And if you don't know that, and your experience has been one relatively positive experience, you may in fact believe in the notion of American exceptionalism, the greatest country in the world, that so on and so forth. That may be your lived experience. That is not the lived experience of lots of other people. And so we fail our children, but a critical race theorist would ask, why do we do that? Why has that been done? And is that to protect the interest of the dominant group, to maintain the kind of racial hierarchy that we've had in the United States? I think that's what some critical race theorists would say.
Professor Fair, we're running a little bit out of time, and so I wanted to, before I turn it back over to Jackie, I just want to give a little tie-in. First of all, thank you very, very much, and also to those who are participating. Your questions were fantastic, and just thank you very much for taking the time to be along with us with Global Ties Alabama. I do also want to say this about, we live in a global village, and you talked about it. And when we deny people access to education of a global, 360 education, we're going to hurt folks. And like you said, if they're living in their own little sphere, once they go outside of that sphere, and they've been taught that the earth is flat, and they go outside of and find out the earth is not flat. Woo! Big surprise for them, ostracism for them, credibility for them. So when we try to ban this, it also leads towards a totalitarianism in which, you're going to say what the state tells you to think. I mean, wow, this is America, and we should keep our minds open. So we live in a global village. So us being globally, we need to, you don't have to agree, but you should at least hear it. So with that, I want to pass it back on to Jackie for her closing statements.
Professor Fair, I can't tell you how thankful we are for this introductory conversation. And Micah, thank you for moderating. You should know that this is not the end of the conversation. This is to the audience. Professor Fair is still facilitating our invitation to Mr. Delgado and his wife, because we know the interest there is in, as they say today, diving deeper for this information, for greater understanding. And then my real concern is, what can we put into action? And you can't put anything into action until you understand what is needed. So this was a first step. We're looking forward to the availability of the Delgados. And we just thank everybody for joining. We will send as much information out to those of you on this call. The call is available as a recording. So if you're interested in that, please let us know to share it with others. There are so many who need this basic information, and we're just very thankful for your attendance today. We look forward to inviting you to our next Global Perspectives Institute. Thank you so much, everyone, for being on.
Thank you all for allowing me to be here.
Thank
Thank you, Brian.